When people hear social media addiction lawsuit, most assume this is about parents blaming apps for bad habits or politicians taking swings at big tech companies because it polls well. That's not actually what this case is doing. At its core, this lawsuit isn't arguing that social media is morally bad or that people shouldn't use it. It's making a much more narrower and much more legally specific claim. The plaintiffs, a coalition of states and families, are alleging that major platforms knowingly design their products in ways that encourage compulsive use, especially among minors, while publicly downplaying or denying the risks of that design. The companies named include platforms owned by Meta, TikTok, and YouTube. Importantly, this isn't about one viral feature or one bad update. The claim is about systems, recommendation algorithms, infinite scroll, autoplay, notifications, all working together to maximize time on platform. Legally, the accusation isn't just these products are addictive. It's that the companies allegedly knew certain design choices increased harm, continued to deploy them anyway, and in some cases misrepresented what they knew to the public and to regulators. That distinction matters. Historically, platforms have been shielded from responsibility by arguing that they don't cause harm. They merely host content and users choose how to engage with it. This lawsuit challenges that framing by saying if you intentionally engineer behavior through design, you don't get to pretend the outcomes are accidental. It's also why this case is being compared cautiously to earlier product liability fights like those against tobacco or opioids. Not because social media is identical to those products, but because the legal logic rhymes: internal knowledge, external denial, and harm framed as foreseeable results of business decisions. To be clear, none of this means the plaintiffs will win. Courts haven't ruled on whether these claims clear legal existing protections, and the companies deny wrongdoing. This act isn't about who's right. It's about understanding what's actually being alleged, because without that clarity, everything that follows sounds either hysterical or dismissible. And that's exactly the fog this case cuts through. For years, lawsuits against social media companies have tended to die the same way. Not because judges thought platforms were harmless, but because the legal framing kept running into the same wall. Historically, platforms have been treated as hosts. They provide the space, users provide the content, and the harm, legally speaking, is assumed to come from what users say or do inside that space. That framing matters because it's what allowed platforms to argue over and over again, we didn't cause this, we didn't create it, we didn't control it. And in many past cases, courts agreed. This lawsuit takes a different route. Instead of focusing on what users posted, it focuses on what the product itself was designed to do. The plaintiffs aren't arguing that a specific video, post, or comment caused harm. They're arguing that the underlying system, the recommendation engines, the engagement loops, the feedback mechanics were intentionally engineered to maximize compulsive use, even when internal research suggested that design choices could cause harm, especially to minors. That shift is subtle, but legally significant, because once a case is framed as a product design question, different rules start to apply. Product liability law doesn't ask whether a company controlled every individual outcome. It asks whether a company knowingly designed a system in a way that made harm foreseeable, and whether it failed to meaningfully mitigate those risks. In other words, the argument isn't platforms aren't responsible for everything users do. The argument is, if you design a system to pull attention as aggressively as possible, and you know that design creates measurable risk, you don't get to pretend you're just a neutral bystander. That's why legal analysts see this case as distinct from earlier failures. Not stronger, not guaranteed to win, just structurally different. Earlier lawsuits tried to collapse platform harm into speech liability, which almost always triggered immunity defenses. This one tries to separate speech from system design, and then ask whether the design itself crosses into negligence or defect territory. That distinction is still being tested. Courts have not settled it, and it's entirely possible judges ultimately decide that existing protections still apply. But this is the first time in a while that cases have been structured to force that question directly instead of bouncing off the same defenses at the door. That's the real reason this lawsuit matters, regardless of how it ends. Up to this point, we've only talked about why this lawsuit looks different. Now we need to slow down and explain what it's actually pressing against. Because when people hear this could reshape liability protections, it sounds abstract, almost mystical. But those protections are very real, very specific, and very narrow. And understanding them is a key to understanding what this case can and can't realistically do. For most of the modern internet, platforms have operated under a simple legal assumption. They are not responsible for harm caused by user content. If someone posts something harmful, misleading, or dangerous, that liability sits with the user, not with the platform hosting it. That's the legal backbone that allowed social media to scale in the first place. And historically, courts have been very reluctant to interfere with that structure. Because once you make platforms responsible for user speech, you create a chilling effect. Moderation becomes risk management, hosting becomes liability exposure, and open platforms stop being open very quickly. That's why so many past lawsuits failed. They tried to argue that platforms should be punished because of what users did. And courts almost always rejected that framing. It's not saying you're responsible for what users posted. It's saying you're responsible for how the product itself was designed. That distinction matters. In most areas of law, there's a difference between content liability and product liability. Content liability asks who said or shared the harmful thing. Product liability asks, was the system designed in a way that predictability caused harm? And historically, platforms have lived almost entirely in the first category. This lawsuit is trying to pull them into the second. The argument isn't that harmful content exists. Everybody knows that. The argument is that engagement-driven systems, infinite scrolling, algorithmic recommendations, feedback loops tuned for compulsion were intentionally optimized in ways that made certain harms foreseeable. Not guaranteed, not inevitable, but foreseeable. That's the pressure point. If a court accepts that framing, even partially, it doesn't automatically destroy platform protections, but it does something more subtle. It opens the door to treating certain design choices as products, not as neutral infrastructure. And once you're in that territory, different legal questions apply. Questions like, what did the company know internally? What risks were identified but deprioritized? What trade-offs were made in pursuit of engagement? None of that requires judging individual posts. None of that requires moderating speech retroactively. It's about design accountability, not censorship. Now, to be clear, and this is important, courts have not decided that this framing overrides existing protections. That's still unresolved. Legal observers are watching this case not because it's guaranteed to win, but because it's testing a boundary that hasn't been meaningfully tested before. Whether that boundary holds is still an open question. But this is why the case has people's attention. Not because it promises a platform apocalypse, but because it asks a much more uncomfortable question. At what point does a neutral platform become a product that can no longer claim neutrality? And if that line exists, where is it? So here's the part where things tend to get inflated. Once a case like this hits headlines, the story quickly jumps to extremes. This will destroy social media, or platforms are about to be regulated like cigarettes, or this finally kills Section 230. None of that is what this case actually does, or even what it's positioned to do. The most realistic outcome is much narrower. At its core, this lawsuit is testing a boundary. It's asking whether courts are willing to treat certain engagement-driven design choices as products that create foreseeable harm without collapsing that argument into speech liability. Even if plaintiffs succeed at some stage, that doesn't automatically mean platforms lose their core protections. It means courts may clarify where those protections end. One plausible outcome is simply legal clarification. A court could say, yes, product design claims can theoretically exist here, but only under extremely specific conditions. That alone would be a meaningful shift, not because it bans features, but because it draws a clearer map of what's allowed and what's not. Another realistic outcome is procedural, not philosophical. The case could advance past early dismissal, survive motions, and still ultimately fail on evidence. That wouldn't be a win for plaintiffs, but it would still matter. It would signal that these claims aren't automatically dead on arrival, which changes how platforms assess legal risk internally. What's far less realistic is the idea that a single lawsuit suddenly forces platforms to redesign algorithms wholesale or accept blanket responsibility for user harm. Courts move incrementally. They don't rewrite the internet in one ruling. And they're extremely cautious about creating precedents that spill beyond the narrow facts of the case. The exaggerated fear that this instantly opens the floodgates to endless liability misunderstands how conservative courts are when it comes to platform governance. Judges are not eager to become product managers for tech companies. If anything changes, it will change slowly through tight definitions and narrow holdings. So the real significance here isn't a guaranteed outcome. It's that the legal system is now being asked seriously whether some harms can be treated as designed in risks rather than incidental side effects. That question alone is why this case has attention, not because the answer is obvious, but because it's no longer unthinkable.